What if the only person you trusted with your secrets was never unconscious at all? For 10 years, Elin Vale cleaned the silent room of King Alaric Thornvale, believing he could not hear a single word. She told him everything. The palace rumors, the hunger outside the gates, the cruelty of the nobles, even the loneliness she hid from everyone else. But one night when no guards were watching, and Elin finally whispered that the kingdom was being betrayed, the Comatose king did the impossible. He grabbed her hand. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. The king's room always felt like a place the castle had forgotten to finish. The corridor leading to it narrowed by a finger's width, as if the stone itself had decided it didn't want footsteps there. The torches burned lower on this side, same oil, same wick, yet the flames refused to climb. Even the air changed. In the bright halls beyond, voices ricocheted off vaulted ceilings and polished banners, laughter rising and dropping like birds. Here sound seemed to sink into the walls and stay there heavy and damp as wool. Elin Vale had learned to walk quietly long before anyone taught her how. Quiet was survival for someone born without a crest and raised among people whose eyes slid past her like she was part of the furniture. She carried her basin with both hands, the copper warmed by the water inside, and stopped at the door that was always guarded, except often in ways most people didn't notice. The men stationed there were rarely the ones who smiled at her in the kitchens or nodded as she passed with laundry. They were different faces, different shifts, a quiet rotation, precise as clockwork. Elin couldn't remember the last time she'd seen the same guard twice in a week. Today the guards didn't stop her. They never did, not exactly. They watched expressionless and opened the door only wide enough for her to slip through. Then it closed behind her, with a soft final sound more like a seal than a latch. Inside, the light dimmed as if it had to wade through fabric before it could reach the floor. The curtains were heavy layered, always drawn, not because the sun might bother the king. Elin thought. He hadn't flinched at light in 10 years. No, the curtains were there to keep the room from looking too alive, to preserve the lie that nothing could change in here, that the world had stopped at the bedside and would not start again. Elin set the copper basin on the table near the hearth. The hearth had ashes in it, not fire. It had been like that as long as she could remember, cleaned, arranged, never lit, cold by design. The bed was massive carved wood and draped fabric, a relic meant for ceremonies and airs. It looked wrong in the quiet, too grand for how still the man within it was. King Alaric Thornvale lay on his back hands, resting atop the coverlet, his face turned slightly toward the window that never opened. His hair had been cut shorter recently, not by Elin. Someone had come to keep up appearances, to shave him, to trim him, to make sure the realm's silent symbol didn't look like a corpse. He did not look like a corpse. That was the strangest part. The king looked like someone who could wake at any moment, draw breath, and ask why the curtains were closed. His skin was pale but not gray. His lips were not blue. His chest rose and fell steady and shallow, as if he had mastered the art of taking only the bare minimum from the world. 10 years. 10 years since the catastrophe no one spoke about in a full sentence. 10 years since the palace had turned into an organism with one central rule: do not disturb the image of the sleeping king. Elin moved to the bedside and knelt as she always did. Not because protocol demanded it. No one watched her inside this room, but because the posture felt right, familiar, grounding. Her knees knew the shape of this rug, the weave of it, the way her weight settled when she bowed her head. She dipped the cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and began to clean the king's hands. Slow, methodical, each finger, each knuckle the line of his palm. His hands were not soft. They had once belonged to a man who held reins and swords. Even now, calluses remained like faint maps. Elin worked without haste, the way you work when the task is more than a task. This had been her life for a third of her existence. If she hurried, she might have to leave sooner. If she hurried, she might have to return to the noisy halls where every whisper carried a blade. The room swallowed the small sounds, the cloth dragging over skin, the basin's water shifting her breath. Elin tilted her head, studying the king's face. Not with wonder, not with reverence, with the practical attention of someone who had memorized every sign of normal. No twitch at the eyelid, no change in the jaw. Still. She kept cleaning, and as always, she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to make the silence less absolute. "It's raining today," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The garden paths will flood again. The groundskeeper will swear. This time he'll dig new trenches. He won't. He never does. He just complains, and then drinks the last of the cider when he thinks no one sees." No response. Elin didn't pause for it. She was used to talking into a void. It was safer than talking to people. She changed cloths, wrung out the first, and went back to the king's wrist, cleaning the faint lines where a pulse kept time. "The kitchen's short on flour," she added. "They say it's because of the new levy, but that's not it. It's always something else. Someone's holding it at the gate. Someone's making money from it. And the steward will pretend he's shocked when the bread runs out." She looked down at the king's hand, as if it might move in disapproval. It did not. Elin's expression barely changed. She continued because the words were not for him to answer. The words were for her to release. She had learned long ago that if you held everything inside, you became heavy and slow and brittle things broke. When she finished cleaning his hands, she smoothed the coverlet and rose to change the water for his lips. A small cup with a narrow spout waited on the bedside table. She filled it, checked the temperature, and lifted it to his mouth, letting a few drops touch his lower lip. The king swallowed. He always swallowed. It was a reflex, proof of life in the smallest currency the room would accept. Elin watched his throat move and felt a familiar ache somewhere between pity and irritation. "Do you ever get tired of this?" she murmured, "of being handled like a sacred object?" No answer. She wasn't expecting one. It was strange the way the king had become her most consistent companion without ever seeing her. The only person she could talk to without consequence. The only person in the palace who never interrupted her, never laughed at her, never asked who she thought she was. Elin crossed to the window and checked the latch that no one used. She didn't open it. She wasn't permitted, not officially, but she pressed her palm against the cold pane and watched water crawl down it in thin lines. Outside somewhere, horns sounded. A ceremonial call. The kind that made courtiers adjust collars and straighten their backs. The kind that meant Lord Cedric Valor was holding court. Elin returned to the bed, set the cup down, and began the rest of her routine, changing sheets if needed, dusting the carvings on the bed frame, wiping the table, smoothing the rugs where her knees had pressed. Her mouth kept moving. "I heard they raised the tax on the river villages again," she said, wiping dust from the mantle. "They say it's for defense, but there's been no war, just fear, manufactured fear. People pay more when they're afraid." She paused and looked at the king. "If you were awake," she added almost thoughtfully, "you'd be furious. You always hated waste. That's what Martha says anyway. She says you once rode into a winter storm just to deliver grain to a settlement that couldn't pay." Elin snorted softly. Imagine that. A king who actually cared. She didn't realize she'd said it with bitterness until the words were already in the air. She shut her mouth as if the room might punish her for disrespect. But the room did not punish. The room simply held. Dr. Horace Wren arrived at the same time every day, as punctual as prayer. Elin was folding a cloth when she heard the door open. She moved at once to the side of the room, lowering her eyes. Hands clasped, posture perfect. The body of a servant learned to obey before the mind had time to question. Dr. Wren entered with his leather book and his instrument's expression composed in that particular manner of people who believe composure is authority. His robes were clean, his boots polished, his hair pinned back without a strand out of place. Even his breath seemed measured. He didn't greet Elin. He rarely did. He walked to the bedside, checked the king's pupils with a small silver tool, pressed fingers to the pulse, listened to the breath. Then, as always, he wrote. "The condition remains unchanged," he said aloud, his voice flat enough to sound like a verdict. "Continue the established care." Elin bowed her head. "Yes, sir." Dr. Wren made a sound that might have been satisfaction or boredom. He closed the book, glanced once at the curtains, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. His gaze fell on Elin, sharp and brief. "You've been in here a long time," he observed. "Longer than the others." Elin kept her face neutral. "It is my assignment." Dr. Wren studied her as if trying to decide whether she was a tool or a complication. Then he spoke with faint disdain. "Do not become sentimental," he said. "A sleeping man is still a man, and men have value even when they cannot speak. Remember that." Ellen's hands tightened for a fraction of a second. "Yes, sir," she repeated. Dr. Wren left. The door closed again, and the room returned to its familiar hush. Elin exhaled slowly, like someone who had been holding her breath under water. They always say that she murmured, not looking at the king, every day. The same words, like repetition makes it true. She turned to the bed and met the still face. "If you could hear him," she added, tone softening into something almost amused, "you'd probably be bored out of your skull." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the king's hand as she adjusted the coverlet. "If you can hear me," she said, quieter now, "you're the only one who can." It was an old thought, one she had never said aloud before. Once spoken, it seemed too intimate, too real. Elin cleared her throat and went back to work. In the palace, there were rooms for everything, rooms for eating rooms, for praying rooms, for dancing rooms, for conspiring. There were rooms where laughter was allowed and rooms where laughter was dangerous. Elin had learned every pattern of sound through stone. She knew when the highborn were anxious because their voices rose. She knew when they were satisfied because their footsteps slowed. She knew when they were hiding something because they spoke in the hallway instead of behind doors, as if secrets were safer in motion. And she knew that the king's room was the only place where she was invisible enough to be honest. She took advantage of it. "Hear this," she said one afternoon after bringing fresh water. "Yesterday, a soldier was beaten in the back courtyard. They said he dropped a letter." She set the king's cup down carefully. They called it discipline. Elin continued, "But it looked more like a warning, like someone wanted him to be afraid of paper." She didn't look at the king when she said it because looking felt like asking. She dusted the bedside table. "The cooks say the villages beyond the wall are hungry," she went on, voice steady. "But last night there was a feast in the West Hall. I carried wine past the door. I could smell roasted meat and spices that cost more than my yearly wages." Elin's hand paused on the cloth. For a moment, she stared at her own fingers as if they might betray how much the unfairness bothered her. "If you were awake," she said almost to herself, "you wouldn't let it happen." "I think." She gave a small, humorless laugh and resumed dusting. "But I suppose it doesn't matter," she added. "I'm just talking to a man who can't hear. The word can't held the room like a pin." Elin finished her tasks, sat in the chair beside the bed, and let the silence settle on her shoulders. It was heavy, yes, but it was also a refuge, a place where no one demanded she smile, a place where she didn't have to pretend the world was fair. She looked at the king's face again. He looked younger than he should have frozen in time, preserved by stillness. "I don't have anyone to talk to," she admitted quietly, surprising herself. "Martha's always busy. The other girls," she shrugged one shoulder, "they don't like me much. Not when I'm assigned to this room. They act like I carry some kind of curse." She reached out and tugged the coverlet higher, a small domestic gesture. "Talking to you is easier," she said. "At least you don't tell me to stop." A faint smile touched her mouth and vanished. "There are times," Elin confessed, voice dropping, "when I think, if you wake up, you won't remember any of this. Any of the things I said. It'll be like pouring water on stone." She lowered her eyes to her lap. "And then what will I do? All these words, they'll just be gone." She sat like that for a moment, alone with her own breath and the steady rise and fall of his. Outside, the palace hummed. Somewhere a bell rang. A servant shouted for another servant. A noble laughed too loudly. Inside, Elin listened to the quiet, and for a moment it felt like the quiet listened back. It happened at the end of an ordinary day, which was why Elin nearly missed it. She had risen to change the flowers by the window, a task she disliked because the stems were always thorny and the vases heavy. Someone insisted the king's room must look attended, must smell of life, even if the man inside did not participate in it. Elin leaned over the vase, trying to arrange the blooms so they didn't droop toward the floor. A thorn caught her finger, as she hissed under her breath, reflexively pulling back. It was a shallow cut but sharp. Blood welled quickly bright against her skin. Elin shook her hand once, annoyed. She moved back toward the basin to rinse it, and as she crossed the space between the window and the bed, a drop of blood fell. It landed on the king's hand. Elin froze. For a split second, her mind refused to accept what her eyes saw. That small red dot on pale skin looked obscene, like an accusation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, automatically reaching for the cloth. "I didn't mean—" She wiped the blood away gently, and then the king's finger moved. Not a twitch from muscle spasm. Not a random jerk. A slow, small curling of one finger, as if he were trying to close his hand. Elin's breath stopped. Her cloth hung in midair. Her heart hammered painfully in her chest, loud enough that she feared it might wake him even if nothing else could. She swallowed, and her voice came out thin. "My king." The finger went still again, returning to the same position it had held for years. Elin stared, eyes wide, mind scrambling for a reasonable explanation. Dr. Wren had said the condition was unchanged. Cedric had said the king could not respond. Everyone had said it was nothing, she told herself shakily. "It was me. I imagined it." She wiped her finger, pressed a clean cloth to it, and forced herself to finish arranging the flowers. But when she turned back toward the bed, her gaze kept flicking to the king's hand. Her body moved through the rest of the routine, closing the basin, smoothing the coverlet, straightening the chair like she was walking through water. When she finally reached the door, ready to leave, she paused with her hand on the latch. She looked back at the bed. The king lay unchanged, yet Elin's calm had cracked, just barely, like a seam beginning to split. A small doubt had appeared, and she knew with a cold certainty that it would not go away. For one brief second, the king moved. But was it a sign that he was finally waking after years in silence? Or just something the lonely servant imagined? Tell me what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most shocking part of the story. The next morning, Elin entered the room with a different kind of awareness, an uncomfortable brightness behind her ribs. She told herself she was being ridiculous. One twitch meant nothing. Bodies did strange things. Dr. Wren had likely seen it before. There was probably a name for it, a medical explanation that would put the world back into its proper place. Still, she placed the water cup on the bedside table as she always did on the right side. The right side was safer for reasons she could not fully explain. It felt correct. Elin cleaned the king's hands, avoiding staring too long. She spoke less. She listened more. When she finished, she carried the basin to the small adjoining wash area, emptied it, refilled it, and returned. The cup was on the left. Elin stopped so abruptly the hem of her dress brushed the chair. She stared at the cup, then at the bedside table, then at the door. The door was closed. The latch was intact. No one had entered. No one could have entered without the guards noticing. And the guards wouldn't they? Her mouth went dry. I put it on the right, she whispered. No answer, of course. She moved closer, her steps careful, and placed the cup back where it belonged. Maybe I remembered wrong, she said out loud, the words meant to calm her. Maybe I'm tired. She tried to laugh. The sound was small and weak and died immediately. Elin went on with her work, but her hands trembled faintly and she had to grip the cloth tighter to keep the shaking from showing. That afternoon, she pulled the coverlet higher on the king's chest before she left. She made a point of it. She smoothed the fabric until it lay perfectly flat. When she returned hours later, the coverlet had slipped down. Not much, 2 inches perhaps, but enough to expose the collar of the king's linen shirt, enough to prove that someone had disturbed it. Elin stood over the bed, eyes fixed on that slight change like it was an open wound. No one comes in here, she whispered. No one except me. Her voice fell even lower. So who? She stopped herself before finishing the question because finishing it meant giving it weight. Her gaze drifted to the king's face, still, the same calm, expressionless stillness. Elin's throat tightened. This is absurd, she said, forcing a steadier tone. I'm getting carried away. But she did not pull the coverlet up immediately. She simply stood and watched as if waiting for the room to confess. Over the next several days, the room became a puzzle Elin could not stop touching. Small changes repeated. The cup moved, the coverlet shifted. Once she found a pillow slightly angled when she knew she had set it straight. Elin started leaving tiny marks, nothing anyone else would notice. A fold in the blanket, a thread pulled slightly loose, a bit of chalk dust at the edge of the table. All harmless, all meant to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. And each time the marks changed, not always, not every day, just often enough to keep her nerves tight and her heart alert. Then came the breath. Elin hadn't intended to test that. She noticed it by accident because she had spent 10 years listening to the rhythm of the king's breathing as background noise. One morning while cleaning, she mentioned the name that sat like a stone in every servant's stomach. Lord Cedric was in the West Hall today, Elin said casually, her cloth moving over the king's knuckles. He was smiling. I don't like it when he smiles. It means someone else is about to lose something. The king's breath hitched, just once. A tiny unevenness as if his lungs had stumbled over a thought. Elin's hand froze. She stared at his chest, waited. The breath resumed its shallow pattern. Elin swallowed hard. Did you? She began. She stopped, because questions were dangerous. She lowered her gaze to his hand and saw something else. His fingers looked tighter, as if they were holding on to tension. Elin stepped back half a pace. No, she whispered. No. I'm imagining it. A few days later, she told him about the soldier. The one who was beaten, she said, voice low, as she adjusted the cup. They sent him away, quietly. No punishment officially, just gone. Her throat tightened with anger. He kept saying he was innocent. He kept saying he only dropped a letter. Elin reached for the cloth again, and nobody listened. The king's hand tightened. It was small, barely visible, but undeniable. Elin's breath caught sharply. Stop, she told herself. Stop looking for ghosts. But her own heart ignored her. It beat faster, like it already knew the truth her mind feared. From then on, Elin spoke less. Not because she had nothing to say, she had too much, but because each word felt like a test, and she was terrified of what the results might be. She watched more, counted, noted. A suspicion was forming, taking shape the way a shadow takes shape when you realize it belongs to something solid. One morning, Ellen stood at the window with her hand pressed against the cold glass and watched the rain turn the courtyard to mud. She didn't move for a long time. She could feel the king behind her. Not physically, he was still just a body in a bed, but in the new way you feel someone when you suspect they are present. Elin turned slowly. She looked at him the way you look at a locked door when you realize the lock might not be real. If you can hear me, she whispered, voice barely above breath, then she didn't finish the sentence. Finishing it would change everything. She walked back to the bedside and began her routine, hands steady through sheer effort. She waited until she was changing the water. Then she lied. Do you know what I heard? Elin said, keeping her tone light as if she were telling him about kitchen gossip. They're changing the Western watch. 3 days early. She did not look at him. She did not pause. She poured water, smoothed the blanket, and continued as if it meant nothing. In truth, it meant everything. There was no plan, not really, only instinct. If someone in this room was hearing, if someone in this room was moving, then the lie might provoke a reaction somewhere outside. Elin left the room with her stomach twisted tight. All day she moved through the palace like she was holding a secret flame in her hands. At dinner service, she listened harder than she ever had. In the kitchen, the talk erupted the way it always did when servants thought the highborn weren't paying attention. Did you hear someone whispered near the ovens? The Western watch is changing early. Elin's entire body went cold. She forced herself to keep moving, to keep stacking plates as if nothing had happened. They changed it this morning, another servant said. An order came down. Not the usual seal, though. It looked different. Elin's fingers tightened around a tray. Changed, she asked, voice carefully casual. Why? The servant shrugged. No one knows. They said it was urgent. Elin swallowed, mouth dry. It wasn't supposed to be urgent, she thought, because she had made it up. Elin excused herself as quickly as she dared, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She moved through the corridors with a speed that was almost reckless, but she kept her head down her steps, silent. When she reached the king's door, she forced herself to slow, to breathe, to look normal. The guards let her in. Elin closed the door behind her and leaned against it for 2 seconds, just long enough to gather the fragments of her composure. Then she turned and looked at the bed. The king lay as always, but Elin's fear had shifted into something sharper, a clarity that hurt. It's not a coincidence, she whispered. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and stood over him, fists clenched. You can hear me, she said, not a question, not a hope, an accusation. Silence. Elin waited anyway because silence no longer meant absence. She bent down until her face was close to his hand. So, all the things I've said, she murmured, voice breaking slightly, you heard them. No answer, no movement. But Elin wasn't fooled anymore. She straightened slowly, forced herself to resume the routine, but her hands shook badly enough that water sloshed over the edge of the basin. She wiped it up with a harsh motion, anger and fear tangling in her chest. If you're there, she whispered, throat tight, why didn't you? She stopped again, because she didn't want to give voice to the question that might destroy her. Why didn't you save me? Why didn't you stop them? Why did you let me talk to you for years as if you were nothing?" Elin pressed her lips together and kept working. Outside that room, the palace was changing. Elin noticed it the way servants noticed everything in the shift of schedules, the tightness of faces, the sudden presence of unfamiliar men in familiar corridors. Lord Cedric Valor had begun to squeeze the realm like a hand closing around a throat. He spoke of stability. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of the burden of leadership. And everywhere doors began to close, more guards appeared, new patrols, fewer servants permitted in certain halls. Whispers spread like smoke. "They're going to declare it," someone said in the laundry room. "They're going to say the king will never rule again." Elin kept folding sheets, her face blank. "What do you mean, declare it?" another girl asked. Officially, the first whispered, "That he's beyond recovery, that the regency will be permanent." Elin's hands did not stop folding, but her heartbeat quickened. A third servant leaned in, voice hushed. "And if the regency is permanent, the throne becomes complicated. People will start talking about a successor." Someone else made a small, frightened sound. "Can they just change that?" "They can if no one can contradict them," the first girl said. Ellen's fingers tightened on the linen until she almost tore it. The regent had been in control for 10 years, but 10 years of control was different from forever. Forever meant Lord Cedric wasn't just borrowing the crown anymore. He was preparing to become the crown. Elin left the laundry without speaking. She returned to the king's room, steps brisk, eyes down. She entered and closed the door, and the familiar quiet greeted her like a hand on her shoulder. She stood at the foot of the bed and stared at the king. "They're going to replace you," she said softly. The words tasted strange, dangerous. She moved closer and placed her palm on the edge of the mattress, grounding herself. "If you can hear," she whispered, "then you know what they'll do next." Her eyes dropped to his hands, the hands that had moved just barely. Elin swallowed. She felt a new kind of fear rise in her chest, not fear for herself, but fear for him. And that frightened her too, because caring was another kind of vulnerability. The palace did not forgive vulnerabilities. Elin began to understand that the secret in this room was not a curiosity anymore. It was a crisis. That night, Elin did not sleep. She lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of the girls around her. A few snores, the occasional muttered dream, normal human sounds. Elin's mind kept returning to the king's hand around hers, a touch that had never happened in 10 years, a choice, because it had been a choice, hadn't it? Not a spasm, not random. He had waited until she turned away. He had waited until there was no one to see. Elin rose before dawn, dressed quietly, and left the quarters without waking anyone. She moved through corridors she knew by heart, avoiding lantern-lit intersections, keeping to shadowed arches. When she reached the king's wing, she stopped. The corridor was dark and empty, no guards. Elin's blood turned to ice. There were always guards. Even when the rotation changed, even when Cedric played his games, there was always at least one man planted like a statue outside that door. Tonight, there was nothing. Elin stepped forward slowly, every instinct screaming that this was wrong. Her hand hovered over the latch. She pushed. The door opened without resistance. Inside the room was as it always was, dim, still heavy with silence. Elin slipped in and closed the door behind her. She stood in the center of the room, not moving. For the first time in 10 years, she was not here because it was her duty. She was here because she could not do nothing. Elin looked at the bed. The king lay in the same position, face turned slightly toward the window. He could have been carved from stone for all the movement he showed. But Elin knew better now. She took one step forward, then another. Her voice when she spoke was not the steady, storytelling voice she used in daylight. It was rougher, strained by fear she didn't know how to swallow. "If you can still hear me," she whispered, "then listen carefully." She moved closer until she was standing beside the bed. Elin's hands clenched at her sides. She forced herself to breathe slowly. "This kingdom is being betrayed," she said, "not by strangers, not by enemies beyond the wall." Her voice trembled. "By the people in the hall, by the ones who kneel and swear loyalty, and then walk away and talk about your throne like it's furniture." Elin stared at the king's face, searching for anything. Nothing. But she kept going because she had been doing this for years. Speaking into silence was the one skill she had mastered. "They're waiting," she said. "They're waiting for the moment they can say you'll never return, so they can finalize it, seal it." Elin swallowed hard. Her breath hitched. "I don't know what to do." That confession was a crack in her armor. It made her feel naked. Her eyes burned. "I've spent my whole life being small," Elin said, voice breaking, "keeping my head down, doing what I'm told, being invisible." She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, forcing back tears. "But I can't be invisible anymore," not when her voice dropped to a whisper, "not when you're still in there." Elin opened her eyes and looked down at the king's hand resting on the coverlet. She hovered her fingers above it, hesitating. Touch was dangerous. Touch was intimacy. Touch made things real. Still, she let her fingertips brush the back of his hand. It was cool, steady, alive. Elin whispered, "If you really are awake in there, don't leave me alone in this." The room held its breath. Elin drew back her hand, suddenly embarrassed by her own desperation. She took a step away from the bed. "This is foolish," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "I'm talking like a child." She turned toward the door. Her heart hurt. The corridor outside was still empty, still wrong, and the emptiness pressed on her like a warning. Elin reached for the latch, and then a hand closed around hers. It was weak. Not the grip of a man in full strength, not the decisive clasp of a king in a throne room, but it was unmistakable. Fingers, cool, slightly rough, curled around Elin's hand with deliberate intent. Elin froze so completely she could not even inhale. Every nerve in her body flared at once. Her skin prickled. The air felt too thick to breathe. She did not turn around immediately. She was afraid that if she moved too fast, it would disappear, like waking from a dream too quickly and losing it. "My king," Elin whispered, voice barely sound. The hand tightened just slightly as if answering. Elin's breath shuddered out of her. Her knees went weak. She turned slowly, like someone turning toward a cliff edge. The king's eyes were still closed, his face still calm, still distant, yet his hand held hers, not a reflex, not a spasm, a choice. Elin stared at their joined hands, unable to comprehend the reality of it. "You," she whispered, trembling. "You're holding me." No words came. The grip did not loosen. Elin's throat tightened painfully. Fear and shock collided inside her, and beneath them, beneath everything, an ache she had carried for 10 years, suddenly found its target. "You heard me," she said, voice cracking. "All this time. You heard me." The king's hand squeezed again, faint but clear. Elin's eyes stung. She blinked hard. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to run. She wanted to throw open the door and scream into the corridor that the king was alive. But her hand stayed in his, and in that moment the truth settled into her bones with a terrible, irreversible weight. He had never been asleep. And Elin Vale, who had spent 10 years pouring her words into silence, had been speaking to someone real the whole time. Elin did not move for a long time. The king's fingers were still wrapped around hers, weak cold at the edges, but unmistakably deliberate. The contact held her in place the way a hand on a doorframe holds you at the threshold of a room you're afraid to enter. If she jerked away, she could pretend it hadn't happened. If she stayed, her life would split into before and after. She stared at the back of his hand, at the veins faint under pale skin, at the slight tremor that ran through his knuckles like a heartbeat trying to speak. Her first instinct was to scream, but screaming would bring guards, and guards would bring questions, and questions would bring Lord Cedric Vaylor and Dr. Horace Wren, two men who had spent 10 years building a kingdom on the certainty that King Alaric would never stand again. So Elin swallowed her scream until it became a hard, aching knot in her throat. Her second instinct was to run, but running meant abandoning the only answer she had ever been given in the palace. The only proof that she hadn't been talking into emptiness for a decade. The only proof that her words had mattered. Elin lifted her eyes from their joined hands to the king's face. His eyes were closed, his expression unchanged, the same stillness that had defined this room for 10 years. Yet his breath was different now, just a fraction faster, as if the act of reaching had cost him more than anyone would understand. Elin leaned closer, voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "You can hear me," she whispered. "Can't you?" No spoken reply, but something shifted in his throat. A swallow, a hesitation, a tiny change that said, "Yes, I am here." Elin's heart pounded so loudly she feared the walls could hear it. She took a breath through her nose and forced her hands not to shake. She had spent her life learning how to make her fear invisible. Tonight, invisibility was the only thing keeping them alive. "If you can hear me," she said again more carefully, "squeeze my hand once." She guided her fingers fully into his palm, closing the space between skin and skin. His hand felt heavier than she expected, as if it carried the weight of 10 years of silence. She waited. Seconds passed. A full breath. Another. Then his fingers closed slowly, weakly, but clearly around her hand. Elin's other hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes stung instantly, as if her body had been waiting years for permission to break. She didn't let herself cry. She couldn't. Tears made sound. Tears made you sloppy. But her voice cracked anyway. "So, all those days," she whispered, "all those nights, everything I said." She swallowed hard, forcing the words through. "You heard it." His fingers tightened again, an echo of the first squeeze a confirmation. Elin stepped back, half a pace, not because she wanted distance, but because the truth hit her like a wave. It was heavier than silence. Silence had been something she could live inside. This meant she had been seen. It also meant he had seen her, all of her. Every careless complaint, every bitter joke, every moment she'd admitted she had no one. Every time she'd spoken like he was a friend because she believed the room would never punish her for honesty. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and then the humiliation burned away, replaced by anger so sudden it startled her. "You let me," she whispered, eyes locked on his face. "You let me talk like that for years." The king's hand did not release hers. It simply held, as if holding was the only language he could offer. Elin drew in a shaky breath. "All right," she said, forcing her voice down to a whisper again. "All right. We need a way to talk. A real way." She glanced at the door instinctively. The corridor outside remained silent. No footsteps, no armor, no murmured orders. The emptiness of the hall was not an accident. Someone had cleared it. Someone wanted her alone with him. Elin's blood turned cold. She moved back to the bedside and lowered herself into the chair, still holding his hand, as if letting go might erase the moment. Her mind raced, grabbing at scraps of logic like a drowning person grabbing driftwood. He could hear. He could move at least a little, but he hadn't spoken. That meant he couldn't, or it meant he wouldn't. Elin forced herself to slow down. If she panicked, she would make mistakes. Mistakes were fatal in this palace. Okay, she murmured, leaning closer. We're going to do this simply. She lifted his hand slightly and placed it in hers, the way she might guide a child learning to write. 1 squeeze means yes, she said. 2 squeezes means no. She waited, then asked the first question that mattered. Do you understand? He squeezed once. Elin's stomach twisted with something like awe. She kept going, building a small bridge across the abyss. If you close your eyes for a long time, that means danger. Someone is coming, or something is wrong. She watched his face, searching for a sign of agreement. His hand squeezed once. And if you look toward the door, if you can, then it means someone is outside. His hand squeezed again, faint but consistent. Elin exhaled slowly. Her hands were steady now, not because she was calm, but because she had entered the state she always entered. In crisis, narrow, focus, practical action, survival. When did you wake? She asked the question, coming out sharper than she intended. The king didn't squeeze. Instead, his fingers twitched, as if the answer was too complicated for that simple code. Elin glanced around the room. There was a small wooden board near the medicine shelf, something she used to tally his doses when Dr. Wren wasn't looking. A strip of charcoal rested beside it. She reached for it and brought it to the bed. You can write, she whispered. Try. She placed the board on the coverlet and guided the charcoal into his hand. His fingers shook violently. It wasn't a graceful tremor. It was the kind of shaking that came from muscles that had forgotten obedience. The charcoal slipped from his grasp and rolled, leaving a dark streak like a wound across the cloth. Elin caught it quickly and pressed it back into his fingers. Slow, she murmured. I'll wait. She meant it. Waiting was something she knew how to do. The king's hand hovered over the board, his wrist strained, his jaw tightened. Finally, painfully, he scratched a single word. The letters were crooked, the line wavered, but it was legible. Long. Elin stared at it, her throat tightening. How long? She whispered. His hand shook harder. The charcoal slipped again. Elin steadied his fingers, gentle but firm. The king wrote the next word in 2 broken strokes. Years. Elin's head snapped up. Years, she mouthed. 1 squeeze. Yes. The room felt colder, not because the temperature changed, but because Elin's understanding did. Years meant she had been speaking to a living mind for years, believing she was safe in her solitude when she wasn't. Years meant the king had been trapped inside his body, listening to everything, unable to answer. Years also meant someone had been lying for years. Someone had known he was not completely lost and had kept him that way. Elin swallowed hard. After the incident 10 years ago, she whispered, forcing herself to be methodical. Were you truly unconscious? 1 squeeze. Yes. And then you woke 1 squeeze. Your body wouldn't move 1 squeeze. And you could hear everything, a pause, then a very light squeeze. Elin closed her eyes briefly, like she needed darkness to process what light had revealed. When she opened them, she met his gaze. His eyes were open now, barely. Not wide, not dramatic, but open enough to show her the truth in them. They were tired. Not the tiredness of a man who had just woken from a long sleep, but the exhausted awareness of someone who had been awake in the dark for too long. Elin's chest tightened. You've been here, she whispered, voice softening despite herself, alone, inside yourself. His fingers squeezed once. Elin's eyes burned. She looked away quickly, furious at her own tears, furious at the palace, furious at the cruelty of a world that could do this to a man and call it governance. Then she looked back at him, and the anger turned toward him too. Why, she demanded in a whisper, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you show them? The king's hand moved toward the charcoal again. Elin helped him hold it. He wrote a single word with effort, so visible it made Elin's throat ache. Kill. Elin froze. If they knew you were awake, she whispered, they would kill you. One squeeze. He wrote again, each letter like a small act of defiance. Treason. Elin's mind flashed with images, Cedric's calm smile, Dr. Wren's flat voice, the way the guards changed too often, the way the curtain stayed closed, the way the hearth was never lit, not neglect, control. Elin leaned in voice barely audible. You don't know who's behind it? 2 squeezes. No. So he didn't know exactly which hands held the knife. He only knew the knife existed. Elin's eyes flicked to the door again. The empty corridor now felt like proof. Whoever had cleared the guards tonight had power. That power belonged to Cedric. She swallowed hard and forced herself not to panic. You needed time, she whispered, understanding forming, to listen, to learn who was lying. The king's fingers tightened once in agreement. Elin's breath came shallow. And you needed information, he squeezed again. Elin stared at him, her anger shifting into something else, something raw, something vulnerable. Then why me, she whispered. Why let me hear you? Why let me know? The king's hand moved again, clumsy with weakness. He wrote 2 words, broken but unmistakable. You, true. Elin's brows drew together. Me, she whispered. True. The king squeezed once. Elin's lips parted. A short, incredulous laugh escaped her, silent but sharp. You trust me, she said, half disbelief, half accusation, because I didn't know you were listening. His eyes held hers. He squeezed once. Elin's laugh faded. It wasn't funny, it was devastating, because it meant the king trusted her, not for her loyalty oath or her bloodline or her station, but because her honesty was accidental, pure, uncalculated. Elin's voice turned bitter. So I'm foolish enough to be honest. The king's fingers tightened around hers, not as a yes, not as a no, but as a refusal. He reached for the charcoal again, insisting. Elin steadied his hand. He wrote slowly, not fool. The charcoal slipped. He tightened his grip and forced the next word onto the board. Brave. Elin stared at the word until it blurred. No one had ever called her brave. People called her quiet, useful, replaceable, invisible. Brave was something reserved for knights and nobles, people who could afford bravery because the world protected them afterward. Elin swallowed hard. You don't know me, she whispered, voice hoarse. You've never even looked at me. The king's eyes didn't leave her face. His fingers squeezed once, gentle. Elin felt something inside her crack, not the dramatic shattering of a life falling apart, but the opening of a door that had been locked for years. She stood abruptly, needing distance before she drowned in whatever that feeling was. And yet you let me, she whispered, the anger returning in a rush. You let me talk to you like you were nothing. She paced once, then turned back. Did you hear me cry? She demanded softly. Did you hear me when Martha scolded me, when they blamed me for things I didn't do, when they laughed at me in the laundry and I pretended I didn't care? The king's hand twitched as if trying to lift, to reach to answer in a way beyond squeezes. Elin didn't offer her hand this time. She kept her arms crossed over her chest like armor. Did you hear everything? She whispered, voice shaking, and do nothing. She knew the second the words left her mouth that they were unfair. He couldn't do anything. He was trapped, but pain didn't care about fairness. The king closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, his gaze was strained, almost pained, like he was carrying the same question and had no way to put it down. He reached for the charcoal again. Elin hesitated, then gave it to him because she needed to see his answer. Even if it hurt, he wrote slowly, cannot. Elin looked away. I understand, she said, but her voice broke on the last syllable, I do. But understanding doesn't erase it. She turned her face back toward him, forced herself to meet his eyes. I thought this room was the only place I wasn't seen, she whispered, the only place I could speak without consequences. Her throat tightened. And it turns out you saw me the whole time. The king's breathing hitched. His lips moved as if trying to form words that his throat wouldn't obey. A sound escaped, rough, barely audible. Elin. It wasn't clear, it wasn't strong, but it was her name. Elin froze. The king's jaw clenched, his throat working. He forced the words out like pushing stones uphill. You, his voice rasped, broken by disuse, keep me alive. The sentence came in fragments, but it landed whole. Elin's anger didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. It softened at the edges, becoming something heavier, something more complicated. Because those words weren't a defense. They were a truth. He wasn't explaining himself. He was telling her what she had done without knowing. Elin sat down again slowly, as if her legs had forgotten how to hold her. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt too small for the weight of what had been spoken. Then Elin leaned forward, voice low. Then we stop being alone, she whispered. Do you understand? The king squeezed once. Elin took his hand again this time, not as a test, not as proof, but as a quiet promise. In the days that followed, their routine transformed into something else. Outwardly, nothing changed. Elin still entered the king's room each morning with a basin. She still bowed her head when guards watched. She still stepped aside when Dr. Wren arrived. She still cleaned and dusted and adjusted the curtains without ever touching the latch. But inside the room, everything was different. Every touch had meaning now. When Elin wiped the king's hands, she knew he felt it. When she adjusted his coverlet, she knew he understood. When she spoke, she no longer spoke to fill silence. She spoke to deliver information. It terrified her at first. More than once she caught herself blurting something and then flushing hot with embarrassment. I didn't mean, she started one afternoon after complaining about a councilman's perfumed arrogance. The king's eyes softened and the corner of his mouth barely lifted. Elin stared. Are you laughing at me? She whispered. His hand squeezed once. Elin blinked, then a surprised sound escaped her half laugh, half breath. A king who can't move for 10 years, she murmured, shaking her head, and you still have the strength to mock me. His hand squeezed again, slow, as if saying yes. Because you're here. Elin's smile faded quickly, replaced by the sober knowledge that any warmth between them was still wrapped in danger. She stayed longer after finishing her tasks. Not out of sentimentality, she told herself that, but because time with him was time spent building a map of enemies. Elin began to categorize what she heard outside. In the kitchen wing, she heard complaints about shortages and strange deliveries that arrived unmarked. In the guard corridors, she heard about shift changes ordered from above without proper seals. In the laundry, she heard servants whisper about a final council, soon a day when the regency would become permanent. Each evening, she returned to the room and spoke in a careful cadence. 3 things she would say softly. First, the Westgate shipment was delayed again. Second, they moved Captain Rowan's men away from this wing. Third, Cedric met with Dr. Wren after midnight. The king would listen with eyes fixed on her, and his hand would squeeze once for important, twice for ignore, a long squeeze for danger. Elin began to notice how much he relied on her, not just for information, but for anchoring. When she arrived, his eyes were clearer. When she spoke, his breathing steadied. When she touched his hand, the tremor eased slightly. It was frightening, the power of simple presence. One day, as Elin prepared to leave, the king's fingers tightened around hers and held. She paused. "What is it?" she whispered. His eyes shifted toward the door. Elin's spine stiffened. She went, still listening. Footsteps outside. 2 sets. One heavy, one light. Elin withdrew her hand and stepped into position, eyes lowered, posture obedient, just as the door opened. Dr. Wren entered, and behind him stood Lord Cedric Valor. Cedric's presence changed the air. He was not loud. He did not have to be. Power clung to him like an expensive scent, subtle, persistent, hard to wash away. His gaze swept the room, taking in Elin, the bed, the drawn curtains. He smiled faintly. "Elin Vale," Cedric said, voice smooth. "Still here." Elin bowed. "My lord." Cedric stepped closer to the bed, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes rested on the king's face for a long moment, as if he were examining an object he owned. 10 years, Cedric mused. A long time to wait for a miracle. Elin kept her face neutral. Inside, her heart hammered. Cedric turned his gaze to her. "And you," he said softly, "are very loyal to a man who cannot thank you." Elin swallowed. "It is my duty." Cedric's smile deepened slightly. "Duty. Yes. The word that keeps castles running." He moved closer to Elin, just enough to invade her space without appearing aggressive. "Tell me," Cedric said, voice quiet, "has anything changed lately?" Elin's mouth went dry. She lowered her eyes further. "No, my lord." Dr. Wren watched her like a hawk watches a field. Cedric tilted his head. "Are you sure?" Elin forced a small, respectful nod. "Yes, my lord. The king remains the same." Cedric's gaze flicked to the king's hands. Elin felt it like a blade. Then Cedric looked back at her. "You spend a great deal of time in here," he said, "more than required." Elin kept her voice steady. "The room must be kept clean." Cedric hummed as if considering that answer. "Of course," he said softly. "Clean, orderly, quiet." His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Quiet is important," Cedric added, "especially when a kingdom is unsettled." Elin's fingers twitched, but she kept them still. Cedric stepped back. "Continue your work," he said, then turned toward the door. "Dr. Wren, ensure our preparations are complete." Dr. Wren bowed slightly. "Yes, my lord." Cedric left. Dr. Wren remained, his expression now less composed. He approached the bed, checked the king's pulse longer than usual, listened to the breath, examined the pupils. He wrote something in his book, then he turned to Elin. "Has His Majesty shown any unusual reactions?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. Elin bowed her head. "No, sir." Dr. Wren's eyes sharpened. "Are you certain?" Elin kept her tone plain. "I am a cleaner, sir. I would not know what counts as a medical reaction." Dr. Wren stared at her for a long moment, then wrote again. He left without another word. When the door closed, Elin turned back to the bed and exhaled shakily. He suspects she whispered. The king's eyes held hers, and then he closed them for a long moment, the signal they had agreed upon. Danger. Elin felt her blood chill. "What are they preparing?" she whispered. "What does preparations mean?" The king's hand moved, reaching for the charcoal with clumsy urgency. Elin guided it into his fingers. He wrote slowly. "Council." Elin nodded, throat tight. "The final council." He wrote again. "End." Elin's breath caught. "End," she whispered. "End of what?" The king's eyes flicked toward the medicine shelf. Elin's gaze followed. She stared at the neatly arranged bottles, the doses she had watched Dr. Wren measure for years. Then she understood with sick clarity. "End of you," she whispered, barely able to breathe. The king squeezed her hand once. Elin closed her eyes. Fear pressed in from all sides, squeezing until she could hardly think. Then she opened her eyes again. She had survived a palace by being invisible, but invisibility wouldn't save him. She leaned close, voice steadying into something hard. "Then we don't let them," she whispered. The king's eyes locked onto her intense despite exhaustion. His fingers squeezed longer this time, a silent grip that felt like both gratitude and warning. Elin swallowed. "I know," she murmured. "I know it's dangerous." She took his hand in both of hers. "But if you die," she whispered, voice breaking, "everything I've said disappears. Every truth, every name, every lie I've heard." Her eyes burned. "And I can't go back to speaking into emptiness." The king's fingers tightened around hers and held as long as his strength allowed. Not once, not twice, but a sustained grip, his promise without words. Elin lowered her forehead to the back of his hand, breathing against his skin as if she could share oxygen with him. Then, "Don't leave me in the silence," she whispered. His hand did not let go. And Elin realized that her fear had changed into something else, resolve. The night before the council, Elin moved through the palace with a plan stitched together from instinct and desperation. She prepared a small vial of pale herbal water, something harmless that could mask another liquid's smell and color for a short time. She hid it beneath her skirt in a pocket she sewed herself. She memorized the guard shift patterns Rowan had quietly passed her days earlier when he could. Rowan had become a shadow of an ally, never too close, never too obvious, but present in the spaces where Cedric's influence thinned. He found her near the linen closet that night, stepping from the gloom like someone carved out of discipline. "You're pale," Rowan murmured. "What's happened?" Elin kept her eyes forward as another servant passed. Only when the corridor emptied did she whisper Cedric entered the king's room with Dr. Wren. They asked questions. Rowan's jaw tightened. "And in Dr. Wren is changing the medicine," Elin said, voice low. "I'm sure of it." Rowan's eyes darkened. "You're certain?" Elin nodded once. "Tomorrow is the council. They'll want the king finished, officially." Rowan exhaled slowly. "Then you need to be careful." Elin's hands clenched. Careful won't keep him alive. Rowan stared at her for a moment, then pulled something from inside his cloak, an old wax-sealed note, blank on the outside. Inside, he murmured, is a list of men still loyal to the crown. Not many, but enough to keep certain doors from closing. Elin took it with shaking fingers. "Why are you helping me?" Rowan's gaze shifted distant. "I guarded that door 8 years ago," he said quietly. "There were nights I heard movement inside, nights I told myself I imagined it." His mouth tightened. "I've lived with that guilt. If there's a chance, a real chance, that His Majesty is still there, still fighting, then I won't stand by and let Cedric bury him while we all pretend it's mercy." Elin's swallowed throat tight. "Thank you." Rowan gave a short nod, then added, "If you're caught, they'll call you mad. They'll drag you out and laugh while they kill him anyway." Elin's eyes hardened. "Then I'll shout until someone stops laughing," she whispered. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, then murmured, almost like a prayer, "May the old gods keep you." Elin slipped away before anyone could see them together too long. Morning came too quickly. Elin woke before dawn, her body already tense, as if the day had started in her bones. The palace was unnaturally quiet the way a room is quiet before a verdict is read. Servants walked softer, Nobles spoke less in hallways, saving their voices for the spectacle ahead. Loyal guards were gone from the king's corridor. Faces Elin didn't recognize stood outside the door. Cedric was cutting the last threads. When Elin entered the king's room, Dr. Wren was already there, as if he had slept in the doorway to ensure she couldn't act. On the silver tray sat a new bottle. The liquid inside was darker than anything Elin had seen before, almost amber, catching the weak light like honey. Elin kept her head down. The medicine has changed today, Sir Dr. Wren stirred the bottle with a silver spoon, not looking at her. His condition has worsened. A stronger dose is required. Elin approached as if to take the tray. Allow me to administer it. Dr. Wren's hand stayed on the tray for a beat too long. No, he said. Today I will do it myself. Elin's blood ran cold. She forced herself to breathe normally. Of course, sir, she said, voice obedient. Then she dropped her cloth. It fell with a soft slap onto the rug. Elin bent quickly to pick it up, deliberately bumping the small side table with her knee. A bowl of rinse water tipped and spilled onto the carpet, darkening the fibers. Dr. Wren snapped his gaze to the mess. Since when are you careless? Elin bowed low, making herself smaller. Forgive me, sir. I'll clean it at once. Dr. Wren clicked his tongue in irritation and turned to the door. Fetch fresh towels. One of the guards outside moved to obey. In that brief moment, 2 heartbeats no more, Elin moved. Her hand slipped inside her skirt pocket, retrieved the harmless pale vial. With the other hand, she swapped bottles dark for pale in a motion so smooth it looked like she was simply wiping the tray. Her fingers shook, but her years of cleaning had trained her to act without hesitation. She tucked the dark bottle into the hidden pocket and returned the pale one to the tray, exactly where the dark one had been. Dr. Wren turned back, still annoyed eyes on the spill. He didn't notice. He lifted the bottle, measured a spoonful, and fed it to the king. Elin watched the king swallow with difficulty and felt her knees nearly give, but it wasn't poison. When Dr. Wren finally left, Elin closed the door behind him and nearly sagged against it. She rushed to the bed and leaned close, voice shaking with relief. I did it, she whispered. I changed it. The king's eyelids fluttered, barely open, but his gaze found hers. His fingers moved faintly. Elin took his hand. I'm taking the real bottle to Rowan, she whispered. The king's hand tightened weakly, but it was worry. Elin met his eyes. You have to trust me. The king squeezed once. Elin didn't waste another breath. She left with a tray of soiled cloths, head down, walking like any servant. She took the long route to the east corridor and slipped into the old fabric storehouse, where dust-coated bolts of linen no one used anymore. Rowan was waiting, cloaked, his posture rigid with contained readiness. You're late, he murmured. Elin pulled the dark bottle from her hidden pocket and pressed it into his hand. Dr. Wren was going to give this to the king before the council, she whispered. Rowan opened it, sniffed, and his face tightened. This isn't sedative, he said. What is it? Elin asked. Rowan's voice dropped. Something that stops a weak heart without leaving obvious marks. A merciful end, they'll call it. Elin's stomach lurched. I need you to keep it, she said, forcing herself not to freeze. And if they drag me out in the hall, you show it. You show it to everyone. Rowan studied her. Do you understand what you're doing? Elin's answer came quiet and firm. I've been inside that room for 10 years, she said. Today I finally step outside it. Rowan nodded once and handed her the sealed list. Not many loyal men remain, he said, but enough that the great hall doors won't close behind you. Elin took it, tucked it away, and walked out before fear could catch up. The great hall had been dressed like a coronation, pretending to be a funeral. Banners hung high. The royal crest glittered under torchlight. Nobles lined the sides in pale silks and darker ambitions. The council sat near the dais faces, solemn with practiced grief, and the throne remained empty. In its place at the center of the hall, a ceremonial chair had been placed, subtle but not subtle enough. Cedric intended to sit. King Alaric was carried in on a formal bier, draped in royal cloth, his face pale, eyes closed. Dr. Wren walked beside him, holding a parchment sealed with the physician's mark. Elin followed behind, officially only a servant, unofficially the only person in the hall who knew the king was listening. Cedric rose his voice, carrying without effort. For 10 years, Cedric said this realm has waited for a miracle. But we cannot chain our future to a body that no longer holds a mind capable of ruling. A murmur rippled. Some bowed their heads in false sorrow. Others looked relieved, hungry for the stability Cedric promised, and the power he would distribute like favors. Dr. Wren stepped forward and unrolled his parchment. According to the final evaluation, he proclaimed, "His Majesty possesses no awareness, no response, and no possibility of recovery." Elin stood behind the bier, hands clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. She watched the king's chest rise shallowly. He was weak, but he was there. Cedric lifted a hand. "Therefore," he said, in the name of responsibility. Elin stepped forward. Gasps. Whispers. A servant was not meant to step into the center of the hall. Dr. Wren hissed through his teeth. "Step back. You have no authority here." Elin didn't move. "That report is false," she said. The hall went silent for a beat. Then laughter started small at first, then spreading like spilled wine. Cedric looked at her as if she were dirt on polished stone. "A maid," he said smoothly, attempting to instruct the council on medicine. Elin met his gaze. "I'm not instructing, I'm telling you what I've seen." Dr. Wren's voice turned cold. "You've stared at a sleeping man too long and invented a story to comfort yourself." Elin's throat tightened. Fear surged, but she forced the words out anyway. "He can hear you." Laughter swelled. A noble woman covered her mouth. A lord shook his head with amused pity. Cedric's smile sharpened. "Remove her," he ordered, lifting a hand toward the guards. "This hallucination does not belong before the throne." 2 guards seized Elin's arms. Alan's pulse roared in her ears. She twisted, but their grip was iron. Her eyes found the bier. The king lay still. For one terrifying heartbeat, she felt the ground tilt under her. What if he can't? What if the poison was only part of it? What if she has dragged herself into the light, just to be crushed? Cedric stepped close enough that only she could hear him. "You should be grateful," he murmured, voice velvet over steel. "I could bury you with this nonsense. Instead, I will simply cast you out." Elin lifted her chin even as the guards dragged her. "You're afraid?" she whispered. Cedric's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid of a servant who forgets her place." Elin turned her head toward the hall and shouted with everything left in her chest. "He can hear you. For 10 years he has heard everything." The hall erupted in louder laughter. Dr. Wren shook his head, feigning sadness. Enough. The guards hauled Elin toward the doors, and then a voice cut through the noise, firm, controlled, authoritative. "Then let His Majesty deny it." Sir Rowan Hale stepped forward from the side of the hall. Silence snapped into place. Cedric's head turned sharply. His smile faltered for the first time. Rowan's gaze flicked to Elin just once, then to the bier. The hall held its breath. On the bier, the king's hand moved. Not a twitch, a lift, a visible, undeniable movement that drew a gasp from a noble standing near enough to see. Dr. Wren spun toward the bier, his face blanching. Impossible. The king's eyes opened, slowly, heavily, but fully awake. The laughter died as if someone had smothered it with a cloth. Cedric took a half step back. For the first time in 10 years, he had no prepared words. King Alaric placed his hand on the bier's edge and pushed. His body trembled with effort. He sat up, breathing hard, refusing help, even as a guard instinctively moved to assist. The king raised one hand, an unmistakable command. The guard froze. King Alaric turned his head, his gaze finding Elin amid the crowd. It wasn't dramatic, it was precise. A man who had listened for 10 years knew exactly where the truth stood. Then he swung his legs off the bier. His feet touched stone. He rose, slow, painful shaking, but he rose. King Alaric Thornvale stood, thin, pale, unsteady, but undeniably the king. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, cracked like a door forced open after years. 10 years, he said. He looked across the hall. 10 years, I have listened. The great hall fell into a silence so deep Elin could hear the torches sputter. Cedric found his voice pushing calm into it like a mask. Your Majesty has only just awakened. Your memory may be confused. The king's gaze shifted to him, steady cutting. I heard you. King Alaric said slowly, each word deliberate. Weeping at my door. Then stepping into the corridor to discuss my throne. Cedric stiffened. The king continued, turning his eyes to Dr. Wren. I heard you. He said lower my dose when inspectors came, and increase it when they left. Dr. Wren's face drained. That was necessary treatment. Rowan lifted the dark bottle. Then explain this, Rowan said. Dr. Wren's mouth opened. No sound came. The king turned back to the nobles. I heard you speak of my people as burdens, he said. I heard the names of villages left hungry to fund feasts. I heard the names of soldiers punished because they knew too much. Some nobles bowed their heads. Others stepped away from Cedric as if distance could absolve them. Cedric's composure cracked. The realm needs stability. A helpless king cannot rule. The king watched him for a long moment. And a traitor cannot poison his king, King Alaric said, and call it stability, Rowan signaled. Loyal guards moved in and sealed the doors. Cedric's eyes flashed. You have no proof beyond the babbling of a maid. The king's gaze went to Elin again. No, he said. I have 10 years of your own words, and I have one person who spoke truth when she believed no one was listening. He lifted his hand slightly. Release her. The guards holding Elin hesitated, then obeyed instantly under the weight of the king's voice. Elin's arms dropped to her sides. Her wrists were red, but she did not bow her head. King Alaric began to walk toward her. Each step was an effort. He refused help. He refused a cane. Pride wasn't the reason. Control was. He would not let Cedric's people touch him again. Elin instinctively whispered, You shouldn't stand this long. A ripple of shock passed through the hall because the first thing the maid said to the king was not reverence, but concern. The king's mouth twitched almost a smile. Still ordering me, he rasped. Elin's eyes burned. In the room, you couldn't argue. The king stopped in front of her. He raised his hand, the same gesture she had known in a different form in the dark. Hear this, he said to the entire hall, voice still rough, but steadying with purpose. They spoke to the crown. He looked at Elin. She spoke to me. And then before nobles, councilmen, and traitors alike, he extended his hand to her. Elin stared at it. The first time he'd held her hand, it was in secret in the dark when no one could see. This time he offered it in full light before the whole kingdom. Her throat tightened. She placed her hand in his. His grip closed around her fingers, stronger than before, still trembling, but sure. Cedric barked, desperate now. You would lower the dignity of the crown for a servant. The king didn't look away from Elin's face. I am saving the crown, he said, from men who believe a throne matters more than people. Cedric's mouth shut as if the words were a slap. The king turned slightly still, holding Elin's hand. I do not choose her because she served me, he said, voice firming. I choose her because when everyone spoke of power, she spoke of the hungry. When everyone waited for me to die, she kept me alive. When I could not speak, she still spoke truth. He lowered his voice just enough that only Elin could truly hear the last line. And because in 10 years of silence, he murmured, your voice was the only thing that made me want to return. Elin's grip tightened around his hand. This time the answer, the promise, came from her. The aftermath unfolded like a storm finally breaking. Cedric was taken in chains to the lower cells under Rowan's supervision. Dr. Wren was arrested with his ledgers and medicines. The council was suspended pending investigation. Loyalists, few but fierce, stepped forward, now that fear no longer ruled the hall. King Alaric did not order executions in rage. He demanded exposure. Do not let them die in darkness, he told Rowan later, voice steadier but still hoarse. They ruled by lies. Let them live long enough to hear the truth spoken about them in every village they starved. Rowan bowed. Yes, your majesty. Elin stood nearby, silent, still feeling the phantom pressure of hands on her wrists. King Alaric's gaze found her again. Elin, she looked up. For a moment, his expression softened into something that didn't belong in a throne room, relief, gratitude, and something rawer beneath it. You did not abandon me, he said. Elin swallowed. I didn't know you were there. You were still there, he answered. That is what matters. Months passed. The king recovered slowly, painfully, learning to walk without shaking, learning to hold a pen without his hand betraying him, learning to sleep without the fear of waking poisoned. He had to rebuild not only strength, but trust. Elin changed too, though less visibly. She no longer wore a servant's uniform. People didn't step over her in corridors anymore. They looked at her sometimes with awe, sometimes with resentment, sometimes with fear. She disliked all three. In private, she remained stubbornly herself. She still moved quietly. She still noticed everything. She still carried cups of water and scolded the king for standing too long. One afternoon, the curtains in the old room were opened for the first time. Light spilled in bright and honest, turning the dust into shimmering gold. The bed that had once felt like a tomb now felt like furniture. The king sat in a chair near the window, a cane beside him, a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He was watching Elin arrange flowers carefully this time, wary of thorns. There are others who can do that, he said, nodding toward the vase. Elin didn't look up. They put the water cup on the wrong side. The king's mouth curved. I used that to call you. Elin froze for a heartbeat, then shook her head, a small smile appearing. Then stop calling me like that, she said. Call me like a normal person. The king lifted an eyebrow. And how does a normal person call you, Elin? Finally looked up, eyes bright with something lighter now. By speaking, she said simply. The king chuckled, soft, real. Elin sat by the window later, almost unconsciously talking, as she used to, telling him about the cook hiding honey cakes in the lower pantry, and Martha pretending not to notice, about Rowan arguing with a stubborn lord who still believed power belonged only to bloodlines. The king listened, leaning back, sunlight on his face. After a while, he said gently, I'm awake now. Elin turned her head toward him. I never thought you were asleep, she replied. The king extended his hand. Elin placed her hand in his without hesitation. No guards waited outside the door. No secrets pressed against the walls. The room that had swallowed sound for a decade now held a quiet laugh, a shared breath, and the steady warmth of two hands joined by choice, not desperation. Sometimes the world tells you your voice doesn't matter because you have no title, no crest, no power anyone can measure. But truth has its own weight, and it doesn't care who carries it. Elin survived by being invisible. Yet what changed a kingdom was the simplest thing she did. She spoke honestly when she believed no one was listening. And Alaric survived, not because the palace protected him, but because one ordinary person refused to let silence become the final verdict. In the end, the story isn't only about a king who woke up, it's about the quiet courage of showing up every day, telling the truth, and holding on even when the world gives you no proof that it matters. Thank you for staying with this story of quiet courage, truth, and a voice that refused to disappear even in silence. If this journey of Elin and her king moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. A like or a simple subscribe helps bring more stories like this to life. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, there are many more unforgettable tales waiting for you here.